Kia ora and welcome back to the Happy Saver podcast. I'm Ruth, tuning in from a beautiful Aotearoa, New Zealand. And in each brief episode, by which I mean long, I get to dig into the money story of an everyday Kiwi and I share them with you in my own words. I've interviewed real people who are figuring out their finances in their own way. And I just love turning their experiences into something that you can learn from. Now, why do I keep making this podcast? Because hearing how others handle their money is such a simple, powerful way to spark ideas for your own financial life. So take the bits that work for you, leave the rest, and build something that feels right for your whānau. So thanks for hanging out with me today, whether you're out on your commute, you're out for a walk or a run, or you're just pottering around the house. Right, enough from me, let's get straight into it. Today I'm sharing the story of Steve and Sarah, not their real names, but they're a UK couple who, many years ago, packed up their lives, moved to Aotearoa and built a really solid financial life together. Now from the get-go, they've been a great team. With money, they're well educated, they're curious, hardworking, and just brave enough to take big steps when the chance came along. Now over the years, they've invested in property, in shares, and themselves, learning plenty along the way. And like many of us, they've had a few financial detours, several property disasters, but their long-term habit of saving and investing has quietly set them up for a strong and flexible future as they approach retirement in their late 50s. Now, this conversation is going to be full of insights from Steve's engineer brain, the steady teamwork he and Sarah share, and the real-life curveballs that have made them rethink what matters most. Now, it's an honest, practical story about the power of keeping things simple, staying curious, and building the kind of financial life that lets you enjoy today, while still, of course, planning for tomorrow. Now, whenever I pick up the phone for a kōrero with someone like Steve, I know I'm in for a detailed chat, and he did not disappoint, and I'm sure that those listening will be able to pull out little nuggets of wisdom from the information that he shared on behalf of him and Sarah. But before I really get into things, let me tell you about today's fabulous sponsor. I like to think of myself as being onto it when it comes to knowing what my money is up to when I'm not looking, but I can't be paying attention all the time. Thank goodness for Pocketsmith. While I was soundly sleeping recently, somebody silently took money for a software subscription I had forgotten I even had. The next morning, coffee in hand, Pocketsmith immediately highlighted this transaction. A quick check using their powerful search engine for transactions showed me that a year had flown by since I'd first signed up. Straight away, I contacted the company, cancelled the subscription, and had them reimburse the charge. If you want to find expenses in your budget that you have forgotten, Pocketsmith is your secret weapon to regain control of your finances, avoid unnecessary spending, and reallocate funds to more meaningful or essential areas of your life. If you want to supercharge your finances with Pocketsmith, have we got a deal for you. Happy Saver listeners get a whopping 50% off your first 2 months of Pocketsmith's foundation plan. To get your deal, go to pocketsmith.com/The Happy Saver. That's pocketsmith.com/The Happy Saver. Now, as I mentioned, Steve and Sarah are not their real names. Like many people that I chat with, they're very happy to share their financial information in the hope of helping others, but they prefer to keep their anonymity, which is fine by me. Now, Steve was born in Birmingham, in England, into the only home his parents ever lived in. Sadly, his father passed away very recently, in his mid-90s, at which point his mum moved into a care home. They purchased their home for £2,000 in the late 1950s, and 75 years later, it has just gone on the market again. Staying so long in a single home is a rare thing these days. His dad worked long hours as a builder and carpenter, while his mum raised Steve and his 2 older brothers, plus worked a part-time job as a cleaner. He is the youngest by 5 years, so by the time he was a teenager, his brothers had already headed off to university, meaning that he actually had the house to himself. Now, growing up in the 70s and the 80s, he said that you didn't need money to do stuff. Instead, you played in the street, you went to the local parks, you climbed the trees, and you played in the streams, all without adult supervision. and you came home when you wanted something to eat. The family lived a simple life, and as far as money went, they didn't go without, and they had clothes to wear to school, food on the table, and camping holidays in North Wales. The family had one car, which his dad took to work each day, and Steve walked to school or he took the bus to places that he needed to go. Now, the odd bit of pocket money he received was spent on sweets at the local dairy, and as far as managing his own money went, he recalls a post office account and a bank book where every time he went in with cash, they wrote down his new balance plus interest that he had earned, and he reflected that a good savings ethic was passed on to him. If he wanted something that was not the norm, the expectation was that he would need to save for it, or he and his parents would go 50-50. Beyond that, he understood that if you wanted money, you had to work for a living. At home, he could see how income impacted their lives. Steve recalled that their very first overseas holiday actually got cancelled because his dad lost his job. While today's families might go anyway and figure out how to pay for it later, his family cancelled the holiday, which is the better option, I do believe. His dad, who was an incredibly hard worker, then decided to strike out on his own and become self-employed, and he settled into the rinse and repeat lifestyle of working 6 days a week and going to church on Sundays. But his family was also in scouting for their whole life, so a lot of nights were spent out in a tent having fun, and the whole family did finally get to take that overseas holiday to Spain. And holidays continued, but as each brother left home, the travelling party just got a little bit smaller. Until finally, and I think this is a classic sign of the times, his parents decided to take a week-long trip on their own, leaving Steve home alone. And how old was he, you ask? Well, about 13 years old. Can you imagine doing that today? His school only knew about it when he failed to get a slip from his teacher signed by his parents, and he had to explain why. At the age of 17, he was getting ready to head off to university himself, and he would need a car to get there. So his dad said, well, you'd better come and work for me in the summer to make some money, and it might keep you out of mischief. Him and his dad left home at 7 a.m. and returned at 6 o'clock, and he was not sure his skills were up to par for the pay that he did receive, but again, it reinforced that money comes from mahi. He said that in 1984 he had saved up and paid £2,000 for a Ford Orion. He went 2.5 hours north to Bradford to go to university, and because he was heavy into science and math, he studied a 4-year degree in electrical engineering. His elder brothers studied mechanical and chemical engineering, so a family of engineers. He graduated in 1989 at the age of just 22, and you know my next question. How did he pay for it? Well, his timing was fortunate because he was the last cohort to get through when study was free. Plus, his accommodation was subsidised as well. His parents' income was means-tested, meaning that the government paid a little and his parents paid the rest. In addition, as part of his degree requirements, he was actually sponsored by a company, which in his case was IBM, and they paid him a retainer to go and work for them at certain times during his course. Put simply, he said, he felt that he was awash with money. Oh, how times have changed. As we speak, I'm running the math for our daughter to go to university next year in 2026, and it's looking to cost around $30,000 to $35,000 all in for 1 year. Not cheap. Despite feeling awash with money, it took Steve a while to work out how to manage that money. He had set up an interest-earning savings account, plus he kept a good chunk of money in an everyday transactional account from which he had taken physical cash out of the bank that was meant to last him for 10 weeks. However, it lasted just 3. So back he went for more until after many repeat visits, the teller told him his cheque account was now completely empty. Thankfully, he hadn't started in on a savings account. Oops, where did it all go? Well, what he had found out in the first few weeks of term was that he drank a lot of beer and he spent a lot of money on nights out. And that was his first realization at just how quickly you can blow through money, and that he needed to dial things back a bit and create a bit of a plan for what to spend per week. He had to move money from his savings account to cover himself, but he vowed to rein it in. Now, in his final year, he met Sarah, his future wife, and when his degree finished, he headed off to work while she stayed and finished her study, and Sarah was working towards a degree in math, which in time led her into becoming a math teacher. Now, given IBM had been his sponsor at university, he incorrectly assumed that they would just hand him a full-time job. So while all his peers were attending job expos and applying for and securing graduate positions, he didn't bother, meaning he was shocked when they didn't take him on. So off to the careers office he went in a panic, and thankfully in 1990 he picked up a job as an instrument engineer earning £12,000 a year. Now, given he was now a full-time employee, within just 6 months he had bought his first house, which is quite common back then and far more achievable than it is now. He paid £47,500 for a 3-bed semi-detached house, and because his new job and his new home were about an hour away from Sarah, they continued their relationship long distance, catching up on weekends. Now, it is hard to fathom now how someone can buy a house within just 6 months of starting work, so how did Steve manage to do it? Times were indeed different back then. His new company offered him a £5,000 loan, which was interest-free, and he didn't need to start making repayments to it for the first 2 years. Jobs for life were a thing back then, and offers like this were common. His bank would only lend him 3.5 times his £12,000 salary, so this loan from his employer helped him buy the biggest house his money could afford. No part of him gave any thought to interest rates rising or buying less house than his money would stretch to. No deposit was required by the bank, and he turned down the offer of his bank lending him 105% of the purchase price. Now, it blows my mind that this was even a thing. So now this 22-year-old graduate had a £42,500 mortgage with his bank and a £5,000 loan from his employer. His thinking was that his salary would increase soon, so he thought while it might be a financial stretch in the short term, he should just go for it. Now, much like a recent episode I did, his was an endowment mortgage. It is an interest-only mortgage, plus a payment is also made into a saving or investment product, and the theory goes that at the end of the 25-year term, the investment would pay off the capital of the mortgage. Today's equivalent is students taking out debt in order to invest, and at the end of their study, their plan is to take their invested money to pay off their student loan, something that may or more often may not happen. Now, these things always sound good in theory, but they rarely work out in reality. Steve's large purchase and running a house soon started to suck up a lot of his £12,000 annual income, meaning he started to have to seriously budget for the first time. There was next to no money left over for socialising, and the money he had spare to spend for the entire month of going out was what others spent on one night out. Things were tight, especially with interest rates going up, he said, so he took on a flatmate to help with the bills. Hindsight also told him that he had bought at the peak of the housing market at that time, and the value of his home dropped soon after he purchased it. Now, he was not wrong to bank on his income increasing, and just 18 months into his first job, in 1991, he was offered a contracting position in the oil and gas industry up in Aberdeen, which was a good 9 hours away from where he currently lived. He was paid £50,000 gross a year, a huge jump up from £12,000. So, what do you do when the house you bought has dropped in value? You try to sell it, but no one was buying, and you have already accepted a job in a different part of the country. Well, you become an accidental landlord and rent it out, of course. Well, that is not quite true. He did get a £45,000 offer, which was £2,500 less than what he paid 18 months prior, but his real estate agent said, "Don't take it, Steve. We can do better than that." No more offers came in, and good old hindsight told him he should have taken it and run. But now in Aberdeen, he spent 6 months renting a room off his brother and his family while he worked long hours at his new job. But what about the £5,000 loan from his former employer? It was now due for immediate repayment. However, they gave him a few months' grace period. Given he was now earning almost £1,000 a week, he had it paid back within 3 months. Steve went from not having enough money to go out for a pint each week to having more money at the age of 24 than he could possibly spend. Thankfully, he spent some of it on paying down his mortgage. Just 6 months into his new job, he purchased his second house, a 2-bedroom loft conversion, for about £40,000 to £50,000. And when Sarah finished her study, she moved up north so they could be together, and she started working as a math teacher. Now, each with a full-time income, they did pause and think about the future, and they each started up a personal pension, which he said were probably into a balanced type fund. Now, balanced investment funds would go on to play a big part in their finances over the coming decades. They basically only knew that you could buy shares or give your money to companies to invest for you for a fee, and giving it to someone else sounded like the easier of the two. They had no idea or memory of the company they used, or that the fees they charged would erode their returns over time, but they knew they were happy to be saving for their future and were investing a reasonable sum of probably somewhere between £500 to £1,000 a month. His first foray into being a landlord of his first rental property was a mixed bag. He used a letting agent, and the first tenant was great, as they often are. But the property was broken into, so they felt unsafe and abruptly left. The next occupants started out fine, but quickly began to be late making rent payments, and Steve found himself chasing the letting agent to make them chase the tenants. The chasing stopped when the neighbour informed Steve that a moving van had been and gone, taking his tenants with it. But during their occupancy, they might not have paid their rent, but they did maintain the home, painting the interior a lurid pink, he said. They eventually managed to sell that home in about 1994 for £39,000, which was £8,500 less than what he paid for it. We didn't discuss, and I suspect he might not have known, how much they lost due to missed rent payments, vacancies, and repairs, that is, painting, over that time. But thankfully they had been paying down the mortgage, so despite the drop in value, they did come out of it with some money once the mortgage was paid off. Their foray into being landlords was over, and they were now back to owning one home that they lived in. His first mortgage had taught him a lesson, so second time round, he just signed up for a standard mortgage instead, and given their combined take-home pay, they were able to make lump sum payments to reduce their mortgage as quickly as possible. Now, in 1994, aged just 26 and 27, they got married on the cheap, enjoyed a lovely honeymoon, and once the vows were set, they fully combined their finances and started making plans together. These days, plenty of couples who have committed to marriage or even raising children together still hesitate to merge their money. So I asked Steve what gave them the confidence to take that leap and what advice he'd offer others. He explained that his parents had always shared everything, time, money, the lot, and he and Sarah simply followed their example. And he said, "It's strange when I meet couples who don't share. It's a bit of a trust issue. To him, marriage is a complete team effort. While one might earn more at a certain time and the other less, nobody's keeping score. She might stop to have kids," he said, "or I might want to retire early. But if it's not our money, making those choices becomes much harder." Given he was working as a contractor, he had to arrange paying his own taxes, and he recalls hearing his colleagues joke that they had a tax bill coming up, so had better work a few weekends to cover it, which made Steve realise that they had not set taxes aside, so he made a point of doing so himself to avoid being caught out. He also saw some of his colleagues get laid off suddenly, and they were instantly selling their possessions on eBay, leaving him to conclude that just because you earn more doesn't mean you suddenly get good with money. It was a financial eye-opener to him to see them go from rich to broke so fast, he said. As a household and with no dependents, Steve and Sarah were earning well, and they didn't blow it on stuff. Yes, they had some nice international holidays, pursuing their shared interests in diving, but they kept their tastes basic. They didn't have a formal emergency fund, but they always kept some savings in the bank to cover time off. As a contractor, Steve needed money set aside for both tax payments and gaps between jobs. Working for himself meant there were no sick days, so he'd usually just soldier on rather than take time off and miss a day's pay. But after 6 years in the job, Steve began to get itchy feet. He was bored, disillusioned, and just ready for a new challenge or a change. Aberdeen didn't help matters. It's not exactly known for long, sunny days and warm weather. And working 10-hour shifts meant he'd leave for work in the dark and come home in the dark, catching glimpses of the sun only on the weekends. Then, in 1997, Sarah spotted an ad in the paper for a seminar about moving to New Zealand. Coincidentally, Steve had been hearing radio ads proclaiming, "Do you like skiing, kayaking, swimming, surfing, hiking, sunshine, and good weather? And did you know you can do it all in one place, New Zealand?" They answered yes to every question and booked a holiday to New Zealand to come and check out if the advertising was true. He joked that while others might find another job, they found another country. Now, I'm always so impressed by those who have the courage to swap all that they know for something completely different. Using an agent, they submitted their residency application, mostly based on Steve's skills. What began as a relaxed process suddenly ramped up, though, when they were told that the visa rules were changing within the week, so it was all on to get the paperwork submitted fast. They took a 5 to 6 week holiday to Aotearoa, they bookended it by a week in Rarotonga and another in LA, and decided New Zealand did live up to the hype. Pretty quickly, their application was approved, and they had 1 year to make the move. They packed their worldly possessions into a container, and it still makes me laugh how much stuff people bring with them. But they wrapped up their jobs, they sold their home for £10,000 more than they paid, they did a farewell tiki tour around the UK, they left their car with a mate to sell, and they boarded a one-way flight to Wellington, arriving in September 1997. They landed with no jobs, but around $100,000, we'll switch to dollars now, in savings, and with the exchange rate sitting at around 3 to 1, well, that money went a long way in New Zealand dollars. They bought a car, settled in the Hutt Valley, and after getting her teaching qualifications recognised, Sarah picked up a teaching role, starting in the first term of 1998, while Steve had a complete career change and used $20,000 of their money to purchase a lawn mowing franchise, and he really enjoyed being outside in the sunshine, working for himself and keeping fit. Given they felt their move was permanent, they also transferred their 2 pension schemes over here, which were worth about $110,000 combined. His was about $70,000 and Sarah's was about $40,000. Which they would be allowed to access when they turned 55. Now, once they had them here, they didn't contribute to them, but these funds certainly showed the potential of what steady investment into an investment product, other than housing, can do. Now, as I've explained in other episodes, there are stringent rules and restrictions around bringing UK pensions to Aotearoa, and he said that there was no end of hardship organising it. They rented for a year before buying a section and building a 4-bedroom home. The project wasn't without its challenges, because partway through, the builder went bust, leaving Steve and Sarah to deal with tradies chasing payment for work that they'd already paid the builder for. So Steve had to step in as a project manager to get the job finished. But by the end, after using some of their savings to fund the build, he reckons their mortgage was around $200,000 to $300,000. This was before he started keeping proper financial records, so he wasn't entirely sure. They moved into the house while it was still very much a work in progress, with the build continuing around them. Now, everything ticked along. They had jobs, and because of the delays to their home, it actually meant that they were able to pay with cash for a long time, which delayed drawing down on their mortgage, which was actually a bonus because the interest rates kept dropping, and they were able to eventually lock in a lower rate. Now, initially they tried to use a revolving credit style mortgage, but he just couldn't cope seeing such a large negative figure in their bank account where it was hard to determine if they were getting ahead of it or falling behind. So they moved back to a conventional mortgage structure. Now, a revolving credit mortgage is a tricky beast, but in my opinion, they work best for disciplined, real focus on discipline, high income earners where there is a big gap between income and expenditure. If you can smash out this type of mortgage, you will come out ahead, but you have to keep the momentum going to do this. While Sarah had a good and steady paycheck, his gardening work was seasonal, and if you don't work, you don't get paid, so money was reasonably tight. Added to that was that he had picked up an injury, so suddenly life began to feel a little hard, and he began to feel that they were just treading water. Then in 2001, Sarah was struggling with her career. She wanted to move into teaching computing, but her school would not let her do it. So she handed in her notice and she spent a year at a local polytechnic learning computing instead. They had also started trying for a family using IVF, with their first round being government funded, but each subsequent attempt costing them around $10,000. So they both had a lot going on. As her course of study finished up in 2002, she began looking for work. And while looking for a new job, she accidentally found one for Steve as well, resulting in them both getting job offers in the same weekend. Hers was as a business computing analyst in Wellington, earning a salary of $50,000 to $60,000, and his was actually up in New Plymouth, working as a senior instrument engineer, earning about $70,000 a year. Neither job was more important than the other, so they decided to live 4.5 hours apart for a period so they could both say yes to their careers. And this is where the house swapping really gets going, so bear with me here. After initially renting in New Plymouth in 2003, they bought a 2-bedroom house for $100,000 for Steve to live in, and again, he got a flatmate to help with the bills. Sarah remained living in their Wellington property. Money was tight. They were paying for IVF treatment to fulfill their dream of having a child, while also juggling 2 mortgages. There wasn't much left to save. They were just getting by. After 2 years of this, their perseverance paid off when Sarah became pregnant, and their daughter was born in 2004. So with their longed-for baby now in their arms, neither wanted to continue with a long-distance relationship. So Sarah took 6 months of maternity leave, and she and their baby moved up to New Plymouth. They sold their Wellington property for $350,000 to $450,000. Again, his record keeping has not quite started yet, and given the confusion during the build, he is actually very unsure if they made a profit or not. He suspects they might have made a very small one. When her maternity leave period ended, they all moved back to Wellington so she could work, and he took 6 months of maternity leave from his company. They sold their New Plymouth house in 2004 for $125,000, making a gain of $25,000, and they purchased a 2-bedroom apartment in Wellington for $385,000. Now, this purchase was a super quick one. Sarah didn't even see it before they bought it. And up until this point, apart from being forced to rent out his first house in England, they had been buying homes to live in and selling them when they were no longer required. But in 2004, they bought a rental property in a university student accommodation complex for $210,000. Now they were using property to grow their wealth, or at least that was the plan. When their child turned 1, Steve's maternity leave ended, and they decided to once again return to New Plymouth so he could return to work. She handed in her notice, which her employer absolutely refused to take, instead offering her a work-from-home position. So they rented out their Wellington apartment. So once back up in Taranaki, after renting for 6 months in 2006, they bought a 5-bedroom house on a large section for $495,000. And it was plenty big enough to house their relatives when they came over from the UK to visit for extended periods. So now, if you're keeping up, they have a home they live in, which they paid $495,000 for, an apartment, which was their former home in Wellington, that they now rent out, which they paid $385,000 for, plus a $210,000 rental property, which is exclusively for tertiary students and is managed by the university. So, wow, it's a lot. These Brits have become property-loving Kiwis pretty darn quick, buying up $1,090,000 of property. Housing is no longer just so you can have a home, it's so you can build equity and perhaps one day even have it provide you an income too. Again, that is the theory at least. Buying houses and owning the houses are two different things though, because they also had 3 mortgages totaling $720,000 across these 3 properties, meaning equity of just $370,000. If you added their $130,000 of pensions to this, he worked out that in 2007, aged 39 and 40, and 10 years after arriving on our shores, their net worth, which is the total of what you own minus what you owe, was $500,000, with the majority of that money being tied up in property. By now, they had a, quote, property portfolio, which in New Zealand seems to be the goal. And there was a bit of an aha moment when he realised how much interest they were paying for their $720,000 of mortgage debt. But they were on reasonable money, with them both working. Sarah was earning about $37,000 gross, working about 21 hours per week from home, and Steve was working full-time, earning $96,000 a year gross. Between the tenants and their rentals and themselves, they were meeting their mortgage repayments, so it all felt reasonably stable. Now, around this time, in 2007, Steve's company set up a workplace superannuation scheme, literally months before KiwiSaver started. In year 1, he contributed 1% of his salary, in year 2, 2%, right up to contributing 5% by year 5, which his employer matched. He was in a balanced fund, but he had no memory of what fees he paid or the fund, etc. It was more of a case of you get what you were given, I think. Importantly, a key behaviour started in 2007 when Steve began to track their net worth each month, a habit that has continued to this day. Thankfully, having already experienced investing in a pension back in the UK, Steve was very comfortable putting money into something other than property, something many Kiwis were still hesitant to do at that time. Unfortunately, he started out buying individual shares, picking and choosing as he went, with what he admits were terrible results. Over the next decade, he thinks they lost around $10,000 to the stock picking. Much like my last episode, there simply weren't as many investment opportunities available then as there are today. He was on the right track, trying to diversify away from housing, but his share picks didn't quite pay off. In 2008, Steve joined the ASB KiwiSaver scheme, taking advantage of the $1,000 kickstart, the annual government contribution, and contributing 4% of his salary while his employer added just 2%. He cleverly timed his sign up with a pay rise, so the extra income went straight into his KiwiSaver and his take-home pay stayed pretty much exactly the same. There was no lifestyle creep here, which is awesome. Unfortunately, he joined a balanced scheme when he was only 41 years old and young enough to join a growth scheme. Had he done so, his balance would be much higher today, but again, knowledge is power. And back then, information about the impact of less exposure to the share market was just not as clear as it is today. But to their credit, they were still investing, which, although their fund choice was suboptimal, has had a big impact on the position that they find themselves in today. In 2008, they also signed their daughter up for KiwiSaver as she received the $1,000 kickstart, but they added no other contributions. Now, for the record, we also signed up our daughter at 1 year old. We took the government kickstart and have made small monthly contributions to her growth fund ever since. I think we've put in about $40 a month. Her balance, aged 18, is $25,000, so investing works. Then Sarah finally joined KiwiSaver in around 2011, signing up to a balanced fund. Why the delay? Well, the incorrect belief that he was investing enough for both of them due to someone showing him a spreadsheet forecasting a future balance of his KiwiSaver fund being $1 million at the age of 65, which felt enough for both of them. Additional reasoning was that given she was on a part-time income, they wanted to bring that entire wage home and not have any carved off for retirement investments. Spoiler alert, that forecast he was given was well off the mark. So, how did these 40-year-olds end up in balanced funds when research tells us that if you have a long period of time before you need this money, you should invest in a more aggressive fund? He said that they were asked to fill out a questionnaire to determine their risk profile. And without knowing anything about how the share markets worked, when they were asked, how would you feel if you lost money? Of course, they wouldn't feel great. So it specified a balanced fund for all of them and their young daughter. Now, my view is that this is the wrong question to ask, especially with KiwiSaver, because we need to help investors understand that the value of your investments goes up more than it goes down over the life of your investment, and this is normal and expected. A drop in value is not a loss, it is a temporary thing. Over the lifetime of their KiwiSavers, they will come out worse off because of taking such a middle-of-the-road approach by signing up to a balanced fund. They could have easily aimed for an aggressive or a high-growth fund. Yes, it will have more ups and downs in the short term, but over the long term, it will have a higher balance because of its exposure to global share markets. But Steve also makes a good point that this was the early days of KiwiSaver, where we were all feeling our way and learning on the go. But for anyone just starting out, now we have the information on the impact of choosing a fund that is too conservative for your stage of life. Volatility and risk in KiwiSaver are not the same thing. Volatility is the natural up and down movement of your KiwiSaver balance as share markets rise and fall. It is just part of investing. Risk, on the other hand, is the chance that you won't reach your financial goal because you panic during those dips, switch funds at the wrong time, stock pick, or invest too conservatively. In short, volatility is normal and temporary. Real risk comes from how you react to it. But at least they were investing, and they were far further ahead financially today because of having started when they did. He explained that with hindsight being 2020, they should have sold their apartment in Wellington instead of renting it out, because the layout of the apartment and the unequal bedroom size suited a small family better than two adults flatting together, and they really struggled to get people to stay longer than a year at a time. Their student rental worked far better given it was managed by the university, and students were abundant at that time. They couldn't foresee that there was anything that might change this. But all in all, they were saving for retirement, and they were actively paying down the mortgage on their home. The first mortgages they took out on the apartments were interest only, and the interest was tax deductible. So they loaded the two properties up with debt, and they tried to pay as much of the mortgage on their own home as they could. By now, their rentals were negatively geared, meaning that they owed more than they were worth. And they also found out that the rent no longer covered the mortgage payment, and they needed to add extra money to top them up. All in all, he said, it was not a particularly healthy situation, but they made it work week by week, and they were still of the belief that buying multiple properties was the way to grow wealth. Who were they taking advice from at this time, I asked? Well, no one really. Individual shares were not working out for them. Their superannuation accounts were bubbling away in the background, and all signs were really just pointing them back to property. But he was now at least tracking what they owned and what they owed, and he could see that they were meeting their mortgage payments plus investing, and this was the start of the process of becoming aware of what they were doing. They had 3 properties, all of which had mortgages. Each adult had KiwiSaver and were making contributions to their balanced funds. Steve also had his workplace superannuation scheme, which seemed to be growing. The bulk of their superannuation savings at this time were in their UK pensions, which were worth about $130,000. Plus, they kept a little bit of cash in the bank. Now, just coming back to the UK pensions for a moment, because I know that there are many people who have brought them over to New Zealand who are struggling to manage them. Well, remember Gail from episode 110? She's recently made the move away from Booster with their excessively high fees to AMP, and she was shocked to learn just how much others were taking from her fund in fees. She was paying an extra 0.5% on top of the already high booster fees for her QROPS scheme to the, quote, advisor who moved her UK pension. She had no idea that for 10 years they had been taking their slice as well. For them, it was money for nothing. When you don't contribute to a fund, you are in a poorly performing fund, and you pay high fees, well, they erode your returns, which is why Steve and Sarah's UK pension funds basically didn't move. Steve and Sarah were paying down their mortgage on their home as fast as they could, and in 2010 they were able to cash in a $70,000 UK pension somehow. He's actually unsure why he was allowed to get it out before the age of 55. Plus they received a timely inheritance of $50,000, and this enabled them to fully pay off the mortgage on their home. So this is a massive goal ticked off. By now their net worth had grown to $700,000, but still 70% of their money was tied up in illiquid housing. He was keen to get the two remaining mortgages down to lessen their interest payments, which in 2010 were around 6.5% on a floating rate, if not higher. Things were ticking along, and they were living quite happily in their large 5-bed house until, in 2015, a big storm blew down the beautiful tree that was the centerpiece of their huge front lawn. I think you might know where this is going. Now, without a tree, their yard looked more like an empty section that would look even better with a house built upon it. All they had to do was subdivide it into two. They could build a new home in their former garden and sell off the original house for profit. So the planning began, and in 2016, the build started. They took out a bridging loan to cover the build itself until they could complete it and sell the existing home, with completion planned for 2017. While there were absolutely complications within the subdivision, as there always are, it was relatively straightforward once all the niggles were ironed out. By now, Steve was approaching 50, and it was a bit of a watershed moment, as it is for many, when he started to think that retirement couldn't be ignored as easily anymore. But what could he do to make money that he was not already doing? He started looking at retirement planning calculators on the Sorted website, which eventually drove him to create his own spreadsheets. From there, he found Mr. Money Mustache and the 4% rule, and Pete from Mr. Money Mustache has a brain as analytical as Steve, so I can see why his content really resonated. Steve started tracking both his income and expenses as a way to predict future retirement expenses. The knowledge was starting to build, bringing his very diverse investment mix together into a spreadsheet of his own making. Now, having paid $495,000 in 2006, they sold their existing home, which now stood on its own smaller 550 square metre section, for $525,000. While they didn't make cash from the deal, they did end up with a paid-for section to build on, plus almost enough money to build a brand new home on that section. The total build cost for their new home was $660,000. They spent an additional $50,000 rerouting power, gas, water, phone, wastewater, sewage, adding a new driveway to the existing house, surveys, lawyers, council costs, and what have you. And all up, they spent about $710,000 all in and ended up with a new 3 to 4 bedroom home and a $50,000 mortgage, which they then set about paying off. Now, as 2020 dawned, life potted along, and they continued investing in their KiwiSavers and his workplace scheme. But they were still unclear what their goals were around retirement. But at least he was tracking their numbers. By now, his salary had risen to about $150,000, and hers had risen too, and she was able to continue her part-time hours so she could be there for their child. Now, they still had 2 properties in Wellington, and they were spending about $20,000 of their income from their jobs to top up their mortgage payments each year because the rent alone was not enough. They were trying hard to get their mortgage debt down low enough so the rent could cover the repayments. But the properties were becoming quite the headache to deal with because, added to their issues, they had found earthquake damage. plus some leaky building issues thrown in for good measure. So, why not add into the mix a global pandemic too? When COVID struck and we all went into lockdown, Steve and Sarah quickly transitioned to both working from home, and they were working side by side at the kitchen table when his phone rang and his employer told him that they were letting him go. Thankfully, he was able to immediately transition to working as a contractor for the same company, albeit on smaller hours. Gone was any sick leave, holiday pay, etc., and he would now be responsible for paying his own taxes too, something he thankfully had a history of knowing how to do. Basically, they paid him out for his 4 weeks' pay, settled up his annual leave, and got him off their payroll to save money, and they could employ him back on an as-needed basis. As soon as he hung up the phone, Sarah called her employer and increased her hours up from 21 to 35, making up for a good chunk of the lost income. Now, I just loved hearing how proactive and decisive this couple were during this time. Because he was no longer an employee, his workplace super scheme paid him out his $210,000 balance, most of which he invested with Superlife. He had already begun a small investment with them, so this felt like a natural place to invest, he said. So what did he invest it in? His was a scattergun approach, he said, with a big chunk being into a balanced fund. He sure does like those balanced funds, plus the New Zealand 50, Australian 200, emerging markets, and the US 500. By now, he estimated that their net worth was up at $1.47 million, with a big chunk of this amount still tied up in housing that doesn't provide any income and costs them money to own. But they had also pushed hard to pay the mortgage off their own home and were now once again mortgage-free on their own home. Confidence was high, and he had even gone online and filled out my net worth questionnaire, which is on my blog, which is for anyone with a net worth over $1 million to share how they did it. In 2021, they eventually sold the apartment that they had paid $385,000 for in 2004, but they sold it for just $120,000. After 17 years, they took a massive loss and sold it for $265,000 less than what they paid. Now, the decision to sell this apartment came after a conversation with an advisor. Sometimes it takes a third party looking in to help you see things clearly. And they asked if Steve and Sarah were sentimentally attached to the apartment because their advice was to get rid of it because it was acting like a millstone around their necks. They told them to take the loss and walk away, which is what they managed to do. They still owned their second property, which had built up some equity thanks to regular mortgage payments. It had been ticking along nicely because it was managed by the university, providing consistent rent payments. It operated on a shared profit model where total rent from the entire complex was divided among the owners. And when occupancy sat at a healthy 96%, he said, things were rosy and the returns were good. But when COVID hit and students moved home to study online, occupancy plunged to 50%. Rent payments dried up and the party stopped. And when COVID settled down, those same students said, why go to Wellington to study when I can do my coursework from home and save on rent? And that change in study habits, coupled with the mightily high rent charged by Wellington landlords, because up until that point they could get away with it, it really worked against Steve and Sarah. Now, while they still own that unit, the income has not yet returned to pre-COVID levels. By 2022, they were pleased to see their Taranaki home valued at $940,000, which was a significant boost that lifted their total net worth up to about $1.9 million. While much of their wealth was still tied up in property that didn't generate income, the tide was beginning to turn as their non-property investments continued to compound. By this point, he was diving deeper into the numbers and he began tracking their finances in a way that excluded their home from the calculations. And when he did that, he found that their cash savings, equity in the Wellington unit, and investments totaled around $850,000, plus their home on top of that. Although still a little haphazard, they were clearly heading in the right direction. Steve was now paying closer attention to their investments, and after completing Rebel Finance School, he began investing in a Total World Fund ETF. In 2023, when Sarah turned 55, she was able to cash out and close her UK pension, freeing them from a poorly performing, high-cost investment and allowing them to redirect the money more effectively. Having learned about the 4% rule, Steve finally had a framework to apply to their own situation. He began crunching the numbers, starting with the simple but vital question, how much do they actually spend now? He realised that without knowing their actual annual expenses, they could never accurately determine how much they needed invested to retire with confidence. Now, the 4% rule is a simple guide for retirement spending. It suggests that if you withdraw 4% of your investment balance in your first year of retirement and then adjust that amount for inflation each year, your money should last around 30 years. Now, it is based on investing into predominantly growth assets, though. For example, if you retire with $1 million, you could withdraw or sell $40,000 in the first year, then slightly more each year to keep up with rising costs. It's not a guarantee, but a really good rule of thumb to help balance spending and preserving your nest egg. Now, Steve decided that they would require $1,850 per week based on their current expenses. Now, that is roughly $96,000 annually, and 25 times this amount is $2.4 million. It's also known as a lot. But he was also aware that they will both receive New Zealand superannuation from the age of 65, which would lessen the total amount they need invested by about $550,000 by my very rough calculations. Plus, he is factoring in receiving rental income, again lessening the amount needed in what he calls his Freedom Fund. Once everything is factored in, he is anticipating needing about $1.5 million invested, a very achievable goal. By 2023, their investments, equity, and cash savings reached $1 million. Now, it was fascinating hearing Steve talk through his timeline and progress at length. A very analytical guy, year after year, he was piecing together a compilation of investments and information and creating his own financial plan. In 2024, he took the free online Rebel Finance 10-week course, which is held by our friends Alan and Katie Donegan, which I hoped might bring it all together for him because they do outline a clear plan to follow. Well, yes and no. Their mantra of investing your Freedom Fund, which is your 25 times your annual income, in 100% equities by way of a Total World Fund or a FTSE Global All-Cap Index Fund, had certainly got Steve thinking. But he felt it was a bit anticlimactic to get all the way to the much-anticipated week 8 of the course, only to hear, invest in a global index fund and take 4% of the total value of your investments as income each year, full stop. He was a bit disappointed, which is the opposite of what I'm used to hearing, because most people are actually relieved that investing need not be complicated at all. However, I think this comes back to his engineer's brain, which is wired for problem solving and naturally inclined towards complexity rather than simplicity. Now, I actually speak with a lot of engineers, and after talking with Steve at length, I've noticed that their strength lies in their ability to analyze detail. But when it comes to investing, I've found that it's often one area where simplicity can outperform complexity. But the only way that Steve will truly work this out, though, is by diving into his spreadsheets and analysing how each of their investments has performed. The numbers won't lie. Now, that new information did get him looking more seriously at where their money was invested. He ultimately concluded that it was time to focus more on fund type and fees, and perhaps begin to move some money away from balanced funds while still adding in his own flavour, which also involves cash and hopefully some income from their rentals. Plus, of course, he is factoring in the fact that additional income will come in the form of superannuation from their 65th birthday. But if they want to start work before 65, which they do, they will also need to factor that into their calculations. And their remaining rental property at that time, well, it really had him thinking. It still has a $50,000 mortgage, and selling it in this current market is probably not achievable, he said. It's student accommodation, so the market is very limited, meaning finding a buyer would be extremely hard. He is stuck with it, tied to it even, and he knows from past experience that you can't always sell when you want to. It has a CV of just $230,000, and if they manage to sell it today for that price, which is absolutely not a guarantee given the Wellington property market, after they paid the mortgage, they would be left with $175,000. Financially, owning it is not killing them, and on their current trajectory, they will be mortgage-free in 4 years, at which point, for the first time, I should point out, since coming to New Zealand, they might actually get to keep the rent. Now, I don't think there is any way I can sugarcoat this, so I'll refer instead to the notes that I wrote that said, quote, "In essence, the rental property investments have been a complete disaster. Shocking. The math just didn't math. So, if owning rental property doesn't make you any money at all, I just had to ask, is he done with buying rental properties? Well, he thinks so. He just doesn't want the grief. And now, given he has found an alternative that does work, it's time to focus on that instead, he said. But his analytical mind questions how effective the 4% rule is for early retirees. I don't. It works. If you have 25 times your expenses invested into a type of global ETF fund, you can sell off 4% each year to replace your missing income. I know plenty of people who have done this. But if you are adding other investments, such as property, cash, and balanced investment funds into the mix, well then yes, I question its effectiveness as well. Steve is currently 58 years old and looking to retire in 2 years' time in 2027. So he is thinking deeply about these questions. But life is what happens while you are busy making other plans. Steve's contract work in the oil and gas industry in Taranaki slowed and then it dried up completely. Over the course of a year, the jobs just disappeared, and since April of 2025, he's been out of work. On top of that, in 2025, he lost both his father and his brother, events that brought life into sharp focus. He's realised he's not immortal and may not live to 90, so it's time to start enjoying life now. Now, for those in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, it's time to listen up. This is exactly why investing early and consistently is so important. Life might be smooth sailing right now, and I really hope it is, but something unexpected will always come along. Having money set aside and investments that can provide you a source of passive income when life does throw you lemons, well, that's going to give you freedom and options, and the ability to navigate tough times without the added stress of worrying about money. So, this is interesting. Steve has his goals to reach, but life gives you a wake-up call sometimes. He would prefer to retire now. So when we spoke, Sarah is still working as an integration and power platform specialist, which provides him a good income, but not enough to live on. So they are topping up using cash savings that they built up while Steve was still working, and he anticipates that this will be gone in about 18 months. Now, while he plots his next step, he's watching their investments, which by now have built up to a point that compounding is doing a lot of the growth, a lot of the work. But is it enough for him to step away from earning an income? By September of 2025, he estimates that they have $1.37 million in their retirement investments, with a target to get to $1.5 million by the end of 2026, meaning he could retire at the age of 60. He has created his own unique and complex mix of investments, and they are as follows. They're currently invested across a range of funds. First up, he's got the Super Life Balanced Fund. It's a mix of income and growth assets with a 5-year return of 6.49%, which is after deductions, which include a fund charge of 0.5% and a $12 annual admin fee. Then there is the Superlife Overseas Share Fund. Essentially, it's a version of a total world fund. It's performed strongly with a 5-year return of 15.33% after deductions. And between these two Superlife funds, they have a combined balance of $480,000. Steve's KiwiSaver is with simplicity and high growth. It's known for its very low fee of 0.24%, and his balance currently sits at $255,000. Still some way off that optimistic 2008 forecast that predicted he'd reach $1 million by the time he turns 65 in 2032. Just a note on forecasting. Personally, given I now have over 10 years of good data of my own investments, I find that they are a far better predictor of future growth than using an online forecasting tool and/or an overly optimistic financial advisor. Now, Sarah's KiwiSaver is with ASB in a balanced fund that charges 0.65% in fees and has delivered a 5-year return of 7.18% before tax and after fees, and her balance stands at $165,000. They've also spread about $93,000 across 4 different providers and funds, and they're as follows. They're in the Invest Now Foundation Series Balanced Fund, which has a fee of 0.36%, although there's no 5-year performance data available due to the fund being relatively new. They're in the Milford Balanced Fund with the highest fee of 1.07%, with a 5-year after fee and tax return of 7.14%. They're with Mercer All Country Global Fund, which has a total fund charge of 0.46%, which is returning 12% over 5 years after fees and taxes. And finally, they have the Smart Total World Fund, which has a fee of 0.4% with an impressive 5-year return of 14.28%, which is after fees and taxes. And finally, I promise finally, they hold about $200,000 in laddered term deposits, providing a bit of stability and liquidity alongside their investments. Now, every fund details their fees and deductions in a different way. To find the fees and returns of all these 4 funds, I went to the Sorted website. It's www.smartinvestor.sorted.org.nz. Now, all of that added up to $1.193 million, almost $1.2 million, either invested or in cash. Without doubt, this is a substantial achievement for Steve and Sarah because it shows that year after year, they have consistently taken a portion of their paycheck and invested it. That is absolutely the secret sauce to their success. Their efforts show that once again, an imperfect plan is always better than no plan at all. Their consistent behaviour of putting a portion of their income into their variety of funds has added up over time. If you add the $175,000 of equity that they might have in their rental property, they have accumulated assets with varying degrees of returns from 0 to 15% of $1.368 million. And it's pretty clear that growth funds outperform balance funds over time. Why? Because they have more exposure to shares. But it begged the question, why on earth does he have 9 different funds spread across 8 providers? As I was taking notes during our kōrero, I struggled to keep track as he listed them for me, and I couldn't help but think that he has put the relatively simple concept of investing outlined in Rebel Finance School and by myself through what my whānau kindly refers to as the complicator, which is a big machine that makes a simple concept quite complicated. They are in a real transition period here. He had goals to reach, but his income that would help him reach them has gone. But they are trying to stick to the plans. For now, they live on Sarah's income, using $1,000 to $2,000 of savings monthly to top up their account when required. But they are also still investing because he is wanting to reach their fine number. They currently try to save and invest $5,000 per month, and this includes the payments they are making on their rental property. The reasoning for the pick and mix of investment providers is that he is testing the impact of fees on performance. But while the fees are important, and the difference between a Milford asset management fee of 1.07% and the simplicity fee of 0.24% is like comparing night and day, I think his energy would be better spent analysing the difference between investing in a balanced fund versus a growth fund. And also worth diving into is the degree of replication he will have across all of these funds. It's kind of like visiting 8 different supermarkets to buy a pick and mix lolly bag. So much replication, and this doesn't bring better returns. It just makes for an unwieldy investment portfolio, and it uses up your valuable time. His time might be better spent working on portfolio optimization and construction, not fees. And I get it, he loves his spreadsheets, and he, like many, get real genuine enjoyment out of doing all this. But if the end goal is early retirement, I'd bring the focus squarely back to making money by streamlining the whole thing. Now, as our long and really enjoyable conversation started to wind down, it was very clear that this whānau is on the cusp of their next stage of life. They are coast-fi, and if they never invested another cent by the ages of 65, they would have exceeded their FI number. But that would require him going back to work. Although he could return to some form of work, ideally he doesn't want to. And I, of all people, understand this sentiment 100%, which is why he is crunching the numbers so much right now. Their income has decreased, but their expenses remain high by choice. But this choice makes achieving his retirement budget of spending $1,850 per week quite difficult. Now, they slice up these expenses in the following way. They allow $500 for holidays, $260 for food, $260 for replacing broken items, $260 for entertainment or leisure, clothing, gifts, or what have you, $200 on insurance, $110 on medical or health stuff, $85 on rates, $80 gets spent on cars, $50 on electronics, and $42 on power. In addition to this, they also give their daughter $330 per week while she studies at university, and this is a payment that will cease when she finishes up in 2027. Plus, when he can, he is still siphoning off money to invest. In which fund in particular, I'm just not sure. So, safe to say, Steve's brain is buzzing with ideas and details. In his last email to me, he had their total net worth, including their home, now at $2.345 million. So, safe to say, they have options. Righto, before I try to summarise what I've learned from Steve into a coherent conclusion, I've just got another quick message from today's sponsor. If your finances are holding you back from living the life you want, try Pocketsmith out. They've got the tools to help you make money management easier. And have we got a deal for you? Happy Saver listeners get a whopping 50% off your first 2 months of Pocketsmith's foundation plan. To get your deal, go to pocketsmith.com/thehappysaver. That's pocketsmith.com/thehappysaver. Steve and Sarah have done so much so well. What a great life they've lived so far. They got educated, they found work they enjoyed that paid well, and over the years they've retrained and shifted into areas that interested them. From the very beginning, they've managed their money as a team, and crucially, they started and stuck with the habit of investing a portion of their income. And then, for a complete change of scene, they had the courage to pack up and move to the other side of the world. And I really admire people who do that. Now, the reason I spend time talking with someone like Steve is to tease out the habits that have helped move them forward financially. That savings and investing habit, that is their secret sauce. It's what has put them on the cusp of retirement in their late 50s. If I'm honest, their many property purchases have probably slowed their progress. It's the money they've invested outside of housing that's built their wealth today. They'd likely be in a far stronger position had they not dabbled in real estate investing. I completely understand buying a home to live in and selling it when it no longer suits. That makes perfect sense to me. But where a lot of people's financial plans go off track is when they try to force a property to make them money. Sure, their current home has worked out well, but the others have mostly been a drag on their wealth. So for that reason, I really hope that they are done with property speculation. The only way to make money from rental property is to treat it like a business with clear goals, annual targets, and a strategy to get in and get out. You need to decide how you will make money from it. Will you live off the rent once the mortgage is gone, or sell it and pocket the capital gains at a certain point, and then perhaps reinvest that profit for passive income? You need a plan for both entry and exit. I meet so many people whose net worth is high enough for them to retire right now, but their money's locked up in housing that doesn't produce an income. Steve and Sarah, though, have tried both paths, property and shares, side by side, and thanks to Steve's meticulous record keeping, they're starting to see where the future wealth will really come from. But far from giving them a hard time, I actually really admire their determination to keep learning about money, which hasn't been easy over the last 30 years. It's only recently, with the rise of practical resources like Rebel Finance School, Barefoot Investor, Mr. Money Mustache, and even this podcast, that everyday people have had access to simple, logical, and just genuinely helpful information. Steve's emails to me were full of detailed tracking, every area of spending carefully recorded as they prepare for what he calls their go-go, their go-slow, and then their no-go years. They expect to spend more money early on before things settle and can be covered by pensions. He outlined several scenarios that they're weighing up: find new work, cut expenses, pause investing, skip having holidays, and, as a very last resort, reduce the support that they give their daughter. Now, when someone like me says, relax, just keep it simple, it's all going to work out, that just sounds like mumbo-jumbo to someone like Steve. He's deep into the analytics, forecasting their future through a chart with 23 categories. So, trust me, there's plenty of detail that didn't make it into this episode, but it's detail that Steve is very much thinking about. So what will they do next? Honestly, I got no idea, but I do know this. They're your classic whai whānau. They understand how much they need, where to invest, how much cash to keep on hand, and they've built in flexibility. They have options and the ability to adjust course whenever they need to. And for that reason, I know that they are going to be absolutely fine. So all that's left to say is a massive thank you to Steve for sharing his time and his story, and to both him and Sarah for giving us such a fascinating insight into the personal finances of a UK Kiwi whānau. And I really look forward to staying in touch and getting some updates down the track. So that is all from me this week. Another bullet point episode, haha. I can't help it that people I chat to are just so darn interesting. If you want to get in touch, you know you can find me at thehappysaver.com, and please do, of course, share my podcast and my blog with your friends. It's the best way that I can help other people learn something new about money. And finally, I would love it if you would talk more about money with your own friends and whānau, and just help me continue to help others be better with their money. So until next time, happy saving.